Hi everyone, I am Justin Lake, Dr. J, today for our fourth podcast of Quantapalooza. We really want to demystify technology in terms that you can understand in your everyday life. And first off, everyone who knows me knows that while I understand that we have to always within LinkedIn and with YouTube and with the other channels talk about the business commerce side, and I understand. I live in a Western based part of the world where assets make move decisions, but I'm not about the brand name, at least with technology. I understand if you're talking about shoes and shirts and sports teams, the brand name does differentiate, but I really want us to see a world at the end of this decade, hitting into 2030, where when we talk about things like AI on one side and quantum computing on the other, and robotics and edge computing as a connective steel threads, I want us to talk about it like saying water, electricity, Wi-Fi. Like it should be brand agnostic. It should be providers who give the best services to people, not gatekeepers who say, well, because it's under our corporation, you have to accept these terms. It's a very 1990s way of technology that I'm just not aligned with anymore. And maybe that's one of the gifts of being in your 50s. You can be a little bit more aspirational about how humanity should have their choices. So let's talk a little bit about taking concepts that if you're on LinkedIn or YouTube or other social media channels, or if you're one of our Quantapalooza researchers working with different communities around the world, including at times, I'm told, seasonally in Antarctica, which I would love to someday be a Quantapalooza live podcast, how to really connect with these ideas. So if you remember in past Quantapalooza podcasts or our research papers, we talk about the theory of everything. So if we're going left to right, on the left-hand side of the bookshelf of the spectrum, pick your metaphor, is AI. AI is essentially the synthesis of everything that humanity has ever captured digitally, as well as life. And we now have robots that are extrapolating different patterns that may not have always been a one-to-one mapping of the input of the data. Much like when you dream, you may dream of a story that didn't happen, but it's a output really of your life experiences or things that you're thinking about. So that's one side of it. On the far right side of it is quantum computing, which remember in past Quantapalooza podcasts we talked about, no matter how small in today's paradigm you take nanotechnology, super small current hardware, at the end of the day, it's a bunch of ones and zeros, yeses and nos, ons and offs. And you can only go so far. It's hard to believe that in 1903, um, air flight, I mean, not just the Wright brothers, there were a bunch of families who rolled the dice and took to the air in 1903. Well, we're in 2026 in a couple of weeks, and we're talking about colonizing Mars. You see how fast humanity works when we actually want to work together. But with quantum computing, you're no longer bound by yeses and nos, ones and zeros, ons and offs. So the power of it could be positive, negative, or anything in between, or yes or no, or all the maybes. It's not just a third vector, it is a significantly huge vector that when you're talking about your options, when you're modeling decisioning, when you're having businesses rely on options, you're talking about if it's done correctly. And by the way, it's hard to do it correctly for now, but if it's done correctly, you're talking about things, some problems, not all problems, but some problems that would take thousands of years that are done by the time of the end of this podcast. Now, the middle area is robotics. And robotics doesn't have to always be a 6'2" robot when Dr. J can stand up straight, which isn't always because I'm 51. It could be edge computing, which is the hardware if you're walking into a bakery or in the airport that helps you make quick decisions, or swarm robotics, which are a bunch of very small robots that can act like magnets and maybe build a bridge or help out somebody that needs to be rescued from a hiking incident, or it could be something that is helping a real world customer. Now let's talk about how you can really understand that, because the whole point of these podcasts is not just to talk about the nerdy part of it, although I would love to nerd out for 12 hours on Joe Rogan or Lex Friedman on this, but I want to do right by you, which is honoring. So, Justin, how do I, use these to get my career to where I want to be, which is completely fair. Now, let's go back to the AI part. If you really think deeply about it, artificial intelligence is just the digital summary of the human experience. And that is not all that different than when you are going online, when you're talking about issues that you care about, when you hear things that are very controversial to you and you're trying to process it, when you're creating ideas, maybe you either you're dreaming or you're doing some art piece or some creative writing piece. It is the realization that 1 + 1 = 3. So when you're going into your job interviews, it's not the fact that some robot has any one single answer that's smarter than all humans combined, because the reality is that we all know the AI models have been introduced so fast to try to make money that there's a lot of room for error. So your superpower on the AI side is to bring the human neurological touch. What I mean by the neurological touch, I mean the brain power, you as a human being, understanding how decisions are made, understanding that if you and I were born in a different culture, we would look at the world differently. If you and I were living in a different economic situation, we would look at the world differently. That there are currently 8.013 billion different ways that human brains today are processing information, and yet the world goes on, right? We're not 8.013 unique individuals. So there is some common ground. So try to apply that calculus when you are doing both your career growth and your career search. On the other end, on quantum computing, yes, it is breathtaking the speed that hardware is evolving. In fact, I would argue, and I'm sure there are a bunch of very proven PhDs across universities who are frantically typing comments for their own views of everything. And again, I invite you to start your own podcast if you have a better way of saying it. But the way that I would say quantum computing is really breathtaking is that it is a way of really applying human and the universe's knowledge, aka physics, in a way that we have levers that would literally take all of us as humans thousands of years to solve. So I'm thinking medicine, right? I'm thinking intellectual property. I'm thinking even ways where we can reduce war and conflict because there are different ways that people can express themselves. And to me, that actually is much more of a hardware discussion than it is a software discussion. So for you as a job seeker, the question that you would ask or offer, whether it's in your job growth or your career search, is how would you take new hardware that could give you trillions of scenarios and make it applicable to your local grocery store, your local walk-in medical clinic, your community bank or college? Because the entrance barriers are much lower, but quite honestly, and again, I'm sure I can't wait to read the comments when I post this from my very passionate academic leaders who I love very dearly, but maybe who have never actually held a job exactly, is that they're going to say, "Oh no, you need to have multiple PhDs and understand these things." And there are some areas in the research space for sure. I meet people smarter than I am every 4 hours on the clock, but I do think it's a very great disservice to not empower the greater we by actually democratizing how it can be applied. Now, the middle road, which I think is super exciting, is robotics. Robotics, I think, is going to be a little bit of a. Remember, in the beginning of this podcast, I said I want a world where there are no brands. Like I will acknowledge, if I'm, NVIDIA or Apple or Tesla, I'm not going to just sort of like, turn out robots with no branding. But what I do think is the science of robotics should be AI agnostic and should be quantum computing agnostic, meaning if I have a robot that's proven to be safe, certified, can work in the part of the world that I'm allowed to work, It shouldn't be, there shouldn't be a poison pill that says, well, if you don't use this exact company for AI or quantum, it won't work. I mean, to me, that's unforgivable. That's unacceptable. And that's where you, as job in your career growth and job seekers, should really evangelize technology that should be based on utility, not based on some 1990s. If you don't have the right download, it won't work. I mean, that's to me, I can say this in my 50s, is barbaric. And you should also advocate, self-advocate, not just for yourself, but for your field, that it should be agnostic. Now, to land this for this particular podcast, what does it mean for you in your career growth? If you look at what we've been talking about in these podcasts, there are breathtaking advances on the software side, on the computer hardware side, and how it's expressed in robotics. But at the end of the day, it's about the people. It's about the human beings. It's about your career, your generational wealth, how you can advocate for things that you love and are passionate about, and also take care of yourself and the people who you care about. And I don't think it has to be either or. The point of this specific podcast is the more that you personalize these technologies for how it works for a brain, how it works for the neurological decisions that people make, how it works for different perspectives, how it works for the human body, how it works for humanity. And then you pair, well, what does it mean for being on the AI side, which is a robot, or the quantum side, which is a robot, or in the middle, a real world robot? What you will find very quickly is you are asking the exact same questions that the CEOs of these top companies are asking every minute, but it's now you in a position of power where you're evangelizing what's important to you, not just waiting for somebody else. With all due respect, and I say this lovingly, right? I come from poverty. I come from where English wasn't spoken in my family, but it comes from a position where you're not waiting for somebody else to tell you how the world is going to be. And if you look at the main comments of LinkedIn, and again, all of them are completely coming from a place where people are passionate about it. But if you look at the comments of people like, I was displaced by a job, which is, by the way, completely legitimate. If you come to the Silicon Forest in Portland, Oregon, you look at like Tektronix and Intel and other companies and our fashion and sports apparel companies who I love. It's a much more lean gangster world than it was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. But with all respect, part of that was coming from an unwillingness to evolve to the market. And this is what I want to evangelize to you as a colleague and peer. And this is what we in Quantapalooza want to evangelize to you, which is yes, there is a tsunami of data decisions, what if scenarios. Yes, it's very easy to be drowning in podcasts and posts, in hallucinated AI areas, in quantum computing physicists who are throwing a bunch of algorithms that may or may not make sense to us. But if you take a deep breath and take control of your story, there are very common, actionable, monetizable, exciting paths that you can tie to your own personal story. And if you start from that heading into 2026, given where the world is going to be in 2027, I really deeply believe you're going to be on the right side of your story, whether it's your wealth story, your career story, you are growing as a human story, you're opening doors that you never thought would exist story. And that to me is the exciting part of technology. Because how do we have this conversation 12 years ago, 120 years ago, 1,200 years ago? You would be born into a life, and that was a life you're going to live for however it was. And it was either that or an ending that was not palatable. And so I do believe that there's some moral obligation for all of us in this moment in history, as complicated as the world is, as sometimes as heartbreaking as the news is, for us to stand strong, both personally, right, in our community, and as a global human narrative, to seize this moment and to both make these technologies work for us in terms of our own wealth creation and our career creation, but to make the world literally better in our lifetime. And I do not believe it has to be either or. Until then, on behalf of the Quantapalooza community, which is in all continents, including, I am told, seasonally in Antarctica, and I believe me, that is one of my bucket list goals, is to podcast you to prove out that this is true. I am Justin Locke, Dr. J. Go forth, make a dent in the universe because your story is worth it, because you're worth it. We'll talk soon. Take care. Cheers.